Like I said, good evening, everybody. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Before we get started tonight, I would like to introduce our museum's director, Mr. Christopher Kolakowski, who would like to just make a couple comments and welcome everybody. Chris?
It helps if I unmute. Thanks, Eric. Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Chris Kolakowski. I've just passed 1 year as director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And it's great to see everybody tonight. It's great to be here for such a great program. Wish we could be doing this in person, but virtual is an acceptable substitute. And it actually helps us expand our audience because I know from many of the registrants we have are from around the state of Wisconsin, not to mention outside the state of Wisconsin as well. So welcome to everybody out there. I also want to send a special shout out tonight to all of the Red Arrow veterans and current members of the Red Arrows in the Wisconsin Army National Guard who are joining us this evening. It's great to see such a great turnout. And you're going to be learning, in case you've ever wondered where a lot of the traditions that animate the Wisconsin National Guard, this is true of many other states' National Guards, they tend to start in World War I. And that is doubly so true for the Red Arrows. And it'll be a good education in where a lot of those traditions came from tonight. For those of you who have never been to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum or are not that familiar with us, we are located in downtown Madison, right on the Capitol Square, directly across the street from the state capitol. We are committed and charged with telling the stories of Wisconsin veterans from 1861, from the beginning of the Civil War, all the way to the present day. We are an educational component of the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. Once we reopen, which will probably be in the foreseeable future, probably this summer, hopefully, come on down and see us. We've got some great exhibits. If you haven't been down in a while, come on down and see us again and refresh what you thought you had seen from us before. But we look forward to having everybody back in person once the virus lets us do that. But anyway, before I turn it back over to Eric here to kick off the conversation, I did just want to say quickly thank you to Jen Carlson and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, without whose generous support we couldn't put on many of our programs, including this one here tonight. And so they are fantastic. Jen will probably be reaching out with a survey after this, and there'll be some other information about the foundation. And so if you want to get some more information, Jen is the person to talk to about that. Jen Carlson is. So without further ado, I'm going to get out of the way. And Eric, I'm going to let you and the team do what you do best and take us into a great program.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And just to reiterate Chris's comment there, I would like to welcome everybody tonight. Thank you for joining us for our first mess night of 2021. This is a quarterly event that we put on, and our next mess night after this one will be on April 22nd. And you can find information about that on our website, wisvetsmuseum.com. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everybody knows if you have any questions for our presenter tonight, please submit them through the chat feature on Zoom. We will collect all those questions up and present them at the end of the program this evening. So please submit your questions via chat. Tonight, we'd like to welcome Dr. Edward Lengel to our Mess Night series, and he will be speaking on the 32nd Red Arrow Division and World War I. Edward Lengel is Chief Historian at the National Medal of Honor Museum. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia, where he was a full professor and directed the Washington Papers Project for many years. He then served as chief historian at the White House Historical Association. He wrote the new history of the colonial Williamsburg as a revolutionary in residence and worked as senior director of programs at the National World War II Museum. Also a professional author, speaker, and battlefield tour guide, Dr. Lengel has written 14 books on American history, including General George Washington, A Military Life, and Never in Finer Company, The Men of the Great War's Lost Battalion. Dr. Lengel is also a co-recipient of the National Humanities Medal and has won 2 writing awards from the Army Historical Foundation. He has made frequent television and radio appearances on the History Channel, Sirius XM, National Public Radio, and many others. And we are very fortunate to have him here tonight to speak to us about the Red Arrow Division. Dr. Lengel, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Good evening, folks. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. I only wish that I could be there with you in person, but we make do with things as they are these days. And it's nice that we have this virtual opportunity to talk together. When the Wisconsin Veterans Museum and Chris Kolakowski and Eric Wright and Jen, thanks to all of you for having me here, contacted me and invited me to speak with you and asked me what topic I would like to discuss, I immediately thought, I want to talk about the Red Arrow Division because I haven't had an opportunity to do this before. And having spent so much time with the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, having written several books about this subject, I've always been fascinated by the 32nd Division. I have to say that the 32nd Division is probably one of the most, if not the most, underappreciated units to have participated in the First World War. Not only did it demonstrate an exceptionally distinguished service record, but I would argue played a critical role in the most important engagement of the AEF in World War I, which was the cracking of the German Hindenburg Line and the Kriemhildstellung at the height of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This was the culminating moment, the most important moment of what remains the largest and the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States. And it was really because of the 32nd Division that the United States forces were able to break through this critical German strong point. Let's see here, but I am going to begin a bit earlier to give you kind of a broad understanding of the 32nd Division's experiences in World War I. Now, just very briefly to give you the overview, the AEF began, the United States declared war, entered World War I in April of 1917. The first American troops began arriving in June of that year from the 1st Division. However, they didn't really move toward the front lines until the end of 1917. Some units were involved in a number of raids. There was nothing really terribly significant, though, until the end of May of 1918, when the United States 3rd Division was rushed toward the front at a little town called Chateau-Thierry along the Marne River. This was a result of an emergency following upon the third in a series of German offensives in the spring of 1918 on the Western Front along the Chemin des Dames on May 27th. So although General John J. Pershing fought hard to create a fully American army on the Western Front, commanded by an American general that would be fighting on its own front, in practice, he had to compromise. And when the British and the French were caught in these really difficult emergency circumstances in the spring of 1918, Pershing agreed, okay, we'll send units in groups up to the front to fight in their own uniforms, definitely under their own flags, under their own officers, but really more broadly under French and British command. So the 3rd Division moved up at Chateau-Thierry, engaged the Germans, and then the 1st Division fought the Germans at a place called Cantigny at the end of May, and then the 2nd Division, which included not just a Marine brigade, but also an Army brigade, let's give them the credit they deserve, engaged the Germans at Belleau Wood in early June, which is the first major American engagement of World War I. And I'll show you some maps in a moment. But after Belleau Wood closed toward the end of June, in July, there were some minor engagements, but the beginning of significant and sustained American involvement in World War I was really initiated on July 15th of 1918. The Germans launched the last of their offensives on the Western Front along the Marne River, were beaten back by largely by French forces, but also by the 3rd Division along the Marne River on July 15th to 18th. This is why the 3rd Division gained the moniker the Rock of the Marne. July 18th, the American 1st and 2nd Divisions launched an offensive called the Battle of Soissons. Following upon this, the Americans began to push back something called the Marne salient, which was a salient that the Germans had driven into French lines on the Western Front in their offensives that spring. And a number of American divisions pushed forward to begin to drive that German salient back. The 32nd Division enters into the fray on the Western Front toward the end of July 1918 at a place called Cierges, relieving the battle-worn and battle-tested 3rd and 28th Divisions. The 32nd Division was organized in August of 1917 from, as you know, the Michigan and Wisconsin National Guard. It was leavened with a heavy dosage of draftees. So it was National Guard, but there were lots of draftees in the division as well. Also, as I'm sure you all know, the 125th, 126th, 127th, 128th regiments made up the 32nd Division, and they were shipped to France in packets in small groups. Generally, like most American units, were sent to the front simply with their basic infantry equipment, but without artillery and without any heavy equipment in January and February and March of 1918. The priority then was shipping bodies, warm bodies, overseas as quickly as possible. And the 32nd Division, like many other divisions, is going to have a pretty rough learning curve. Like other divisions that the Americans send into the fight, they're inexperienced. They have no conception of what modern warfare entails. They're not really trained for the type of combat that they're going to experience. They lack the equipment, and they have to rely on the French for everything from artillery to aircraft to tanks, as well as for things like the Shosho semi-automatic machine gun. I mean, the Americans just don't have a strong understanding of this. And the experience of the 32nd Division is going to be similar to others in that it's going to have to learn on the job. After the troops arrived in France, the division, and this is true of many other divisions, began to lose its original identity. When American National Guard divisions were initially formed at the beginning of the war, it was anticipated they were going to maintain their regional identity. For example, the 26th Yankee Division from New England, the 28th Division from Pennsylvania, and the 32nd from Michigan and Wisconsin. The assumption was going to be that most of the men who would fight with these divisions would be from their parent states. So you would think that most of these guys would be from Michigan and Wisconsin. Unfortunately, in practice, these units were diluted so heavily, and they were shifted about so much that they lost much of their original character. That was definitely true of the 32nd, the Red Arrow. It was after it arrived in France, it suffered the humiliation of being a replacement division for a while, which meant that men who had trained with the 32nd were plucked out and they were sent to serve in other divisions, which is really a shame. But the U.S. War Department and the U.S. Army did not always behave rationally in this war as in other wars. In May, finally, the Red Arrow, as it was sent to a quiet sector near Belmont in France. and it remained there until it was shifted towards Chateau Thierry, as I mentioned earlier, along the Marne River at the end of July. Commander of the 32nd, as you see here, Major General William Hahn, I think was one of the more exceptional American commanders in division commanders in World War I. He was the son of German immigrants. He had been born in Indiana in 1863, graduated from West Point in 1889. He took command of the division in December 1917 after Pershing decided that his predecessor is Major General James Parker, who was a Medal of Honor recipient Spanish-American War, but had been born in 1854, was too old. Hahn was 9 years younger than Parker. It was, this happened a lot also on the Western Front, is that with the AEF in World War I, is that the Supreme Command, Pershing and his staff, decided right before these divisions went into battle, sometimes right before they left the United States, but on other occasions, right before they entered combat. No, I don't really like that division commander. I think I'd like somebody else to command the division. So they would just pop these new officers in there without giving them time to get acquainted with their men. Fortunately, Hahn was up to the challenge. He was stolid, he was dependable, he was very popular with his men. Unlike, I think Chris knows a little bit about Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was called Dugout Doug disparagingly. Hahn was called Bunker Hahn, but he was called Bunker Hahn affectionately, not with any view to putting him down, because that was a nickname that he had been given at West Point. Hahn, according to a West Point classmate, Hahn ruled by love and commanded confidence, and never shared the sentiment of the stay-at-homes that hostilities stopped too soon in November 1918. I did not, Hahn said after the armistice, want to see another of those wonderful lads jeopardized needlessly. In other words, at the end of World War I, Hahn was one of those who thought we need to thoroughly defeat the Germans in order to make sure that this was indeed the war to end all wars. And he had this attitude not because he was a glory seeker or a warmonger, but because he had real affection and real compassion for his men. He understood the responsibility of command, but he also wanted to make sure that his troops had the tools they needed to achieve victory, but also that none of them would sacrifice in vain. And he didn't want a situation in which they would have to come back to Europe and fight again. That was very much his attitude in World War I. The 1st Regiment of the 32nd Division to reach the front is so on July 30th. The 127th Regiment, you can see on the, I'm not sure if my arrow shows up here, but you can see on the right of your screen with the line July 31st, it's really July 30th and 31st. The 32nd Division comes into the line, taking over from the 28th and the 3rd, just below the town of Sierge. The 127th comes into the lines. Remember, these are green troops, but like so many others, they're put into the lines and they're immediately thrown into the attack without even waiting for orders from the division, without carrying out effective reconnaissance. That was, again, very typical. They hit the Germans hard in the first attacks, send the Germans back reeling. Germans are somewhat disorganized and confused, but then the Germans are able to respond, to gather their forces and their reserves, and able to fight the 32nd Doughboys more effectively. And like other divisions who are green, the Red Arrow Doughboys experienced disorganization and confusion simply because of lack of affinity, lack of experience with their officers, lack of experience in combat. Each in his own way, however, individuals became acclimated to the front. One example is Sergeant Lyle S. Cole of the 125th Regiment's Company I. He entered the woods right below Cierge on the night of July 30th and tried to dig a foxhole in the dark so he could get some sleep. And this is a quotation from Cole's diary. He wrote that night, "Too many roots. Try a new spot, more roots. After the third try, I found a place that was easier digging, got down about a foot and found more roots. I reached down to pull the roots out and the bark came off in my hand. It was so dark I could not see what I had in my hand, but from the odor I knew I had run into a Dutchman or a German, and what I had in my hand was the skin off his fingers. He was just getting ripe. I said, to hell with it, curled up in my blanket on the ground and went to sleep." But the hardest lessons they're going to be learning are the lessons they learn in combat. And these are troops of the 32nd Division toward the front in the summer of 1918. Dawn of the final day of July finds the Germans making preparations to pull back toward the Velle River, but the Americans are unable to take advantage to strike the enemy off balance. 32nd Division attacks just after 2 in the afternoon, but although they make steady progress, the Germans make them pay for every step. Again, the Americans just don't quite know how to carry out attacks with sophisticated tactics, combined armed tactics, and the rest. All they know how to do is to advance and to demonstrate the bravery that they had. Sergeant Cole is one of those attacking uphill 212, which is just northwest of Cierge. He wrote, "Sergeant Wojciechowski over on my left called to me, 'Let's give them hell, Cole.' I shouted back, 'I'm with you, we'll show them.' The next time I looked back, Wojciechowski threw up his hands, dropped his rifle, whirled around, and fell to the ground. He was a good friend of mine. It made me so mad, all I could think of was getting to the top and getting at those Dutch bastards. It was a sight I have dreamed of many, many times." He'd never get the opportunity to mete out the revenge, however, because when Cole reached the top of the hill with just a few others, he was shot in the foot by a machine gun bullet and was later evacuated. The remaining Red Arrow doughboys, however, push on, and Cierge fell into American hands. But the Germans, as they would often do when the Americans would capture a position, saturated it with poison gas. The Red Arrow was unable to make another step into the town or beyond, and they have no choice but under this barrage of poison gas, but to abandon their gains and pull back. Now, the 32nd is one of many American divisions that experiences trouble with the French. And despite all the propaganda that was produced about how the Americans and the French loved each other and they got along all the time, in practice, that really often wasn't true. The French and the Americans really often did not get along, whether at the level of the soldiers or at the level of officers. And so a French liaison officer with the 32nd Division said, "Sometimes the fighting was more in the manner of cavalry than of infantry. I mean, the troops advance with dash, and then they fall back. For instance, the 63rd Brigade, 32nd Division, had taken Cierge. The village being then drenched with gas, the brigade evacuated it. But instead of advancing beyond the village, which is in a hollow, it withdrew to the rear, far more exposed to the view of the enemy and his fire." The commanding French general of this sector of the front ordered the 32nd to make a night attack, but the Americans were just too tired. And Hahn and the French entered into a kind of back and forth of who was to blame for the situation. August 1st, the American 42nd and 32nd Divisions attacked, the 42nd being the Rainbow Division, which Doug MacArthur was with, commanding the 84th Brigade. They attack side by side and they make next to no progress. Hahn is becoming increasingly irritated with the French as his casualties continue to climb. and blames the French for forcing his men into too narrow a frontage. But really the problem was Hahn's own officers, his field officers, just not understanding tactics. One example is a company of the 128th Regiment attacked directly uphill against a German machine gun. And in 15 minutes of fighting, as an account went, the company melted away and for 4 days was lost as a unit. It started 200 strong, and it was when it was reorganized a few days later, only 65 men remained. This gives you a sense of the intensity of the casualties that the Red Arrow Division was experiencing just a couple of days after its first move into combat. Remember, these guys have not seen any fighting before. The company that followed it up in attacking the German machine gun was cautioned not to rush into German machine guns out there with the whole company, but to flank the enemy position by platoons. And it did so, but it took 50% casualties. Every other man in that unit became a casualty. They were finally able to capture some significant points, but at heavy cost. The French and the Americans struggle to cooperate with each other as the fighting continues. French unit right next to the Red Arrow Division simply refuses to assist the Americans in capturing a particular hill. Colonel Glenn Garlock of the 127th Regiment, because of this, came to wish, quote, 100 times that day that those Frenchmen were 10 miles away. During the battle, he assumed that the French were to blame for the casualties he suffered, and he confronted General Hahn to ask why no orders had been given for the French to support him. Hahn replied that the high command had said, your new divisions must prove themselves before you can organize American corps and armies and operate independently. For this reason, said General Hahn, General Bullard, who was a corps commander, was storming up and down in the room, insisting that the 32nd Division must prove its fighting quality. If it was unequal to the task, General Bullard might not be allowed, as he said, to take command of the 3rd American Corps, and General Pershing might not be permitted to organize the 1st American Army. General Hahn told Bullard the 32nd Division would camp on Hill 230 that night. So I mention this because it shows that these troops were being driven to capture certain positions in order to prove that American generals and American divisions could do the job. There was so much invested here that the American generals like Bullard, like Pershing, like Hahn felt they had to show that they had a right to form an American army and not just to fight under French command. So that led them in many cases simply to drive their forces, drive their doughboys to the point of exhaustion. As you see these 32nd Division doughboys here, they're not dead. They're taking shelter in total exhaustion in a shell hole. The Germans, being pros, being veterans, pull back at their own schedule. Anytime the Americans meet a group of Germans, the Germans will counterattack, set the Americans back on their heels, and then begin to pull back further. Finally, on August 1st, General Hahn orders his Red Arrow doughboys, after a couple of days in the fight, to pause and prepare for a possible German counterattack, which never comes. However, by that point, the German Marne salient had been wiped out. This is a contemporary piece, as you see the red arrow sticking into a German behind. If you look toward the lower left here, you see the Red Arrow Division advancing on the town called Fismes, which will become one of the most intense engagements the Red Arrow Division ever experienced. Fismes was a town on the bank of a river called the Vesle. 32nd Division advances toward the Velle River as the Germans pull back past burning German supply dumps. They give a sense, the doughboys finally feel, while the Germans are pulling back, maybe we've won this war. But as the doughboys advance further, the rain begins to pour down. They're wet, they're miserable. Many of these guys are falling sick from dysentery because when it's not raining, it's hot, it's muggy, and they decide to drink water out of shell holes as they move forward. Unfortunately, they didn't realize many of these shell holes have corpses in them, and a lot of the guys get sick. Hans' division finally approaches Fismes on the south bank of the Velle River and considers the possibility of attacking across the river. His corps commander Bullard wants him to establish a bridgehead on the other side. The town of Fismes, though, Hahn reported, is located in the valley and undoubtedly will be heavily shelled as soon as occupied by our troops. And this is a picture of the bridge across the Velle River from Fismes into the little town of Fimet. Across on the other side. This is a post-war picture, but it gives you an indication, if you can imagine, shells exploding here, buildings on fire, smoke rising everywhere, machine guns from the terrain beyond firing down into the town. It was a real hellacious scenario that the 32nd Division doughboys experienced. It was as bad as anything seen on the Western Front at that point of the war. The Velle River is about 6 feet deep, 35 feet wide. It's choked with debris. Its bridges are partially wrecked. Fismes and the low ground next to it are fully under enemy observation on the north bank, making it, as one contemporary called, almost an invincible barrier. Here's a picture of more damage in the town. It looks, this is after the rubble had been cleared away. Again, you have to imagine the smoke and the flames pouring out of the town. And as General Hahn predicted, the Germans shelled Fismes and its outskirts so vigorously with high explosive and gas that the Americans just suffered very, very heavy casualties as they forced their way into the town. It is my opinion, said General Hahn, that we can throw bridges across the river tonight and cross a force over without much difficulty. And the two battalions of the 127th and 126th push their way into the village in a series of rushes. There, inside the village, they encounter German patrols, German machine guns, which are very well placed. In some cases, they have to engage the Germans in hand-to-hand combat, fighting from house to house. But nevertheless, these intrepid doughboys who had been in combat for less than a week are able to occupy the place by nightfall. Hahn said, we were having a considerable number of casualties from enemy artillery and machine guns without accomplishing anything during the daytime. So he told his brigade commanders to hold the front with a very thin line of combat troops and prepare to hold on to the river and cross over into Fimet that night. But only a few troops are able to make it into Fimet. And here again, you get a view of Fismes. This, I believe, this is a view from the north. This is what the Germans would have seen looking down the ridge toward Fimet on the north bank, which is a fairly smaller village, to the larger town of Fismes on the south bank. So you have to imagine the 32nd Division doughboys coming from the horizon in front of you and pushing their way into Fismes, fighting house to house and forcing their way up toward the Velle River and the bridges over the river. And this is where the 32nd Division ends its participation in what was called the Aisne-Marne offensive on August 6th. The Americans had succeeded after the Rock of the Marne, the Second Battle of the Marne on July 15th, and the 32nd enters the fray at the end of July in beating back the Germans and eliminating their salient, pushing them back toward the Vel, but they had suffered heavy casualties in the process. 32nd Division is relieved on August 6th and 7th by the 28th Division, and in a period of 1 week, this division had suffered 4,701 casualties, which, if you think about it, American divisions in World War I were pretty large. They called them blockbuster divisions. It's why they had 2 brigades of 2 regiments each, so they were 4-regiment divisions. But we're talking here about overall, for the whole division, 25% casualties. But when you figure the fact that only a fraction of those troops in the division were frontline combat infantry, you're talking more in the realm of 50% plus casualties for the 32nd Division in 1 week of fighting in the first week of August 1918, as you know, what had once been a Green Division. One corporal of the Red Arrow Division observes at the end of this period in combat, he said, "We feel as though we are now veterans and are ready and fit for any job. In fact, I understand we are designated as shock troops." And the French, it was said, called the 32nd Division with grudging respect, les terribles, or the terribles, so the terrible soldiers. But it was just as well that the 32nd pulled out at this point, because the 28th Division, Pennsylvania National Guard, is going to have to get the job of pushing across this river in mid-August from Fismes to Fimet. The Germans will counterattack against the 28th Division bridgehead and utterly destroy it. It was a terrible sight of fighting, but the 32nd Division was what set this up and had truly had a full and bitter taste of war. Fighting peters out along the American sectors of the Western Front toward the end of August. And it's at this point that Pershing in August has finally received permission in mid-August to create American First Army, for finally an American army under American command. The American First Army will fight its first engagement in what's called the Battle of Saint-Mihiel on September 12th, which is a very successful battle, lasts for a few days, but then its culminating experience will be the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which begins on September 26, 1918. I've written about this battle elsewhere, and because this talk, there's so much to cover, and I want to do it in time, is focused on the 32nd Division. I'm not going to say much about the battle overall, except, again, it was the largest and bloodiest battle in American history that remains true to this day, which sucked in approximately 1 million service members, American service members. And over the course of the fighting, lasted from September 26th to November 11th, but the vast majority of the fighting took place from September 26th up to about October 15th or so, 15th or 16th. During that time, in about 3 weeks, the Americans suffered 26,000 killed in action and about 100,000 other casualties. And I always invite people, I mean, if you look at that in comparison to what the French and the British and the Germans experienced over the course of the whole war, it doesn't seem like much. But over that period of time, if you factor it out proportionately, the Americans suffered proportionately much heavier casualties than did the British or the French over the course of the whole battles of the Somme or Verdun. It was incredibly intense fighting, and that casualty count over a period of 3 weeks has never been matched in American military history. We're talking over half the number of total Americans killed in action during the whole Korean War in 3 weeks, and almost half the total of Americans killed during the whole of the Vietnam War in 3 weeks. Short, but unbelievably intense. General Hahn, commanding the 32nd Division, will be moving into the line not in the first assault of the American forces in the Meuse-Argonne, but in the second phase. And I'll show you some maps in a moment. Fifth Corps under General George Cameron will include the American 3rd and 32nd Divisions from the right to the left in the central sector of the American battlefront, moving toward a place called the Heights of Romagne, which I will describe in more detail in a moment, which is the crucial and most heavily defended sector of the entire German defensive network, called the Kriemhildstellung, as part of the Hindenburg Line. And the 32nd Division's first day in action is October 4th, which is General Hahn's birthday. So you see him studying the map here. On the first day in action, Hahn's corps commander will order Hahn to 32nd Division to capture, as you see, the center of your screen, the town of Gênes. Now, this map follows the line of the fighting after the first assault. So you see the first line north of Gênes. You have to imagine this was the only map I could find, unfortunately, that I could put on the screen here. You have to imagine the 32nd Division's line is just below Gênes in the Bois de Cierges. And you see the town of Cierges, which the 32nd had captured earlier in the summer, just below that. So the 32nd Division with the 3rd on its right, initially the 82nd, later the 42nd, the 1st Division on its left, is going to be pushing toward Gênes and then toward Romagne, as you see on the center right. And then you have to imagine, I'm sorry this map doesn't show one of the central features that the 32nd is going to have to capture, is just west of Romagne, something called Côte d'Amarie. I'll talk about Côte d'Amarie in a moment, but you can see the axis of the 32nd Division's advance. The first day in action on October 4th, the orders are wildly ambitious. The 32nd is supposed to advance from below Gênes around the Bois de Cierges, capture Gênes, and drive all the way to the central strong point of the Kriemhildstellung, about around Romagne and Côte d'Amarie, in one day. There's no way that that's going to happen, because the 32nd is relieving two American divisions, the 37th and the 91st, that have been fighting in this sector for days and have suffered incredibly intense casualties. And in fact, the first day that the Red Arrow Division doughboys go into the fight, they pass heaps of American dead from the 91st Division who are just lying there in windrows where they have been cut down by German machine guns and artillery. So these guys are going into action over ground where it's pretty clear that they're going to suffer a pretty intense fight. To make a long story short, over the first few days, the Red Arrow has to fight hand to hand, shell hole to shell hole, trench to trench, regiments rotating in and out, capturing places like the Bois de la Morine, the Bois de Chensec, one rolling hill after another. I was on the battlefield some years ago, and I've walked this path that the 32nd had to follow from Gien up to Romagne, and oh my gosh, you get a real sense of the ground that they have to cover. On October 9th, as you see here, finally, they've captured Gien after a lot of fighting back and forth. They're positioned to attack the actual heights of Romagne, and this is very heavily defended. The Germans on a place called Côte d'Amarie, just to the west of Romagne, are heavily entrenched. Now, I'm sorry that I couldn't find a picture of a map or a map laying out the topography of Côte d'Amarie, but it's pretty easy to visualize. If you imagine a bull's horns of a bull pointing toward the 32nd Division, that's exactly what Côte d'Amarie looked like. It was a U-shaped or a horseshoe-shaped eminence with both of the horns pointing toward the 32nd, pointing toward the south. I have been there. It was impossible to advance between the horns because the hill rose 50 feet of sheer rock. Each of the horns from either point were festooned with barbed wire trenches, gun pits, machine guns, and the Red Arrow was supposed to take these things from the front, from the point inward. 125th, 126th regiments have to carry the assault. They attack on October 9th, they attack on October 10th, and they fight forward bitterly, shell hole to shell hole, until they are utterly exhausted. And Hahn has no choice but to give the Americans a rest, of the 32nd Division a rest. Finally, on October 14th, the Red Arrow Division doughboys launch their penultimate attack. And this is a picture of what it would have looked like from below to climb up one of the horns of Côte d'Amarie. Brigadier General Edwin Winans of the 64th Brigade delivers a message to the Red Arrow doughboys on this, which will be the most dramatic moment of their entire combat in the First World War. And he says, "Soldiers of the front line, 32nd Division, a few hundred yards to the north of you, the remnants of the decimated, cracked divisions of the German army are clinging desperately to the pivotal point of their bruised and broken line on which hangs the fate of their emperor and the empire. The 32nd Division was sent to this sector to shatter that line. You are shock troops, les terribles, the French call you, fighting sons of guns, the Americans call you. You are the very flower of our army, and you who remain up there in front have been tried by fire. The skulkers have skulked, the quitters have quit. Only the man with guts remains. The Americans must succeed. It is not enough to say, I'll try. Your resolve must be, I will." But I think the real mood of the Red Arrow doughboys was captured by Lieutenant Harold Wohl, who wrote in his diary on seeing the attack orders that morning, "O Lord our God, is there no help for the little remnant that is left of Company H?" At the critical moment, as the fighting continues through that long day, which I don't have the time to describe, the 128th Regiment is able to break through just to the east of the eastern horn of Côte d'Amarie, drive through the German lines and capture the town of Romagne, which you see here, to the left rear from the German side of the battle lines, to their left rear of Côte d'Amarie. This forces the Germans to pull back to their left, loosens their hold on Côte d'Amarie, but the battle isn't over yet. The 126th Regiment has to fight their way, slog their way up the eastern horn of Côte d'Amarie, and they finally are able to force a gap in the German wire. But as they open that gap and try to rush through it, they come under intense fire from well-sighted German machine guns that shoot down several Red Arrow doughboys and stop up the gap. And as so many times in this war, it comes down to one individual act of valor that will turn the tide. A combat patrol of 7 men under Captain Edward B. Strom of Grand Rapids, Michigan, maneuvers to another point on the German wire and unobserved is able to cut through that wire. And then as the Germans see them, they push through, and under heavy fire, they continue to advance uphill and reach a point where they can observe the German machine guns that are looking down over the larger gap in the wire that I mentioned earlier. And from 150 yards away, with what these men in Strom's combat patrol called supernatural luck, they're able from 150 yards to fire and land a bunch of rifle grenades in those German gun pits, knock out 10 German machine gun nests, and destroy that section of the German line, which allows the Red Arrow doughboys to push through the gap, shatter the German defenses, capture the east horn of Côte d'Amarie, and then surge over and capture the west horn as well. And in this entirely unheralded action in the Meuse-Argonne offensive is the most important action, far more important than any of the better known actions. And even though I've written a book about them, I have to say it's more important than the Lost Battalion. It's more important than what Sergeant York did. This action of the Red Arrow Division cracks the central German strong point of the central German defensive position against the Americans in the Meuse-Argonne, and indeed a critical strong point to the whole of the Western Front. And here you can see a map showing the 32nd Division's breakthrough in this kind of clear area, this little bubble right below Romagne, sous Montfaucon. You have to imagine here is around where Côte d'Amarie was situated, and they are able to push on in the days that follow and move forward. This is an incredibly important action, and if you ever get over once the airways and open again and we're able to travel, you can go to Côte d'Amarie, you can see this eminence, and you will be in awe, like I was in the times that I've seen it, of this spot. The division over the course of World War I, 32nd Division, suffers a total of 13,261 casualties, with 2,250 men killed in action and 11,011 wounded. And it is third among all American divisions in the number of battle deaths. I would say too that these casualties are an underestimate. This is true for all divisions because the Americans did not effectively report poison gas casualties. They didn't understand that when a man got a whiff of poison gas, it could, even though he wouldn't report to the aid station, it would permanently injure him and shorten his life. There were thousands of men who got poison gas who never reported as casualties. So that number is an underestimate. In what is a beautiful irony, this spot of Romagne is now the site of the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, which is, I highly recommend all of you to visit if you get a chance to go over there once it's possible again. It's one of the most beautiful I'd say it's the most beautiful American military cemetery in Europe, with the possible exception of the one at Omaha Beach, but it's larger than the one at Omaha Beach. and it's sited right there where the 32nd Division fought. I thank all of you for your attention and your patience this evening, and I will be delighted to answer any questions that you may have.
Excellent, Dr. Lengel. That was simply fantastic, and the photographs that you were able to put into your presentation, they just captured me completely.
Thank you, Eric.
Mike, are you ready to go with those questions?
Yep, sure am.
We'll bring those up on the screen. The first question is, was the junior officers that you spoke of, was their lack of tactical prowess due to lack of battlefield experience? Or do you think maybe it was due to the changing nature of warfare at the time?
It was a combination of both, but I would say that the American senior command's willful ignorance of tactical developments in the First World War bordered on the criminal. Pershing, who I have great respect for in many ways, he had a lot of good qualities, he did a lot of good things, but Pershing and his staff, before the United States entered World War I, made almost no effort to study what was happening on the Western Front. And so the result of that is when the United States did enter World War I in the spring of 1917, those who were providing the training for these totally green troops, the United States was trying to build an army of 4 million men from scratch. The men who trained them had no understanding of what had been happening over the previous 3 years on the Western Front. Their understanding of what had been happening was incredibly shallow. They just assumed, well, guys are digging into trenches and they're being blown up by artillery and machine guns, and we're going to get out of that because we're not going to fight in the trenches. We're going to take them down with rifles and bayonets. Where the truth is that the British and the Germans and also the French had made a number of really remarkable tactical innovations in the art of infantry attack to attempt to learn how to break through, whether by infiltration, various forms of combined arms. So when these junior officers who were all well-intentioned reached the front, they just had no idea what to do. And, so they were experienced, but they could have been taught if the Army had made a stronger effort to learn from what was happening up to that point.
That piece that you talked about was trying to charge a hill, a 50-foot, rock-laden hill that was just covered by machine gun fire. You hear so many instances of that in World War II. By the time the Americans got there, you would think that possibly somebody would have picked up on some of these things by now and realized that you just don't do that.
Well, another thing that's interesting there too is that the American divisions that experienced combat early on, say the 1st and 2nd and 3rd divisions that experienced combat in early June, did not transmit the lessons that they had learned to other divisions. And that was a failure of the AEF command, that very little effort was made to study early actions, to see what these divisions were experiencing. And then some of the later arriving divisions, like the Red Arrow, could have saved hundreds of lives, at least, if they had been told what the 1st Division had experienced back in May. They could have said, okay, don't do this. Please don't do this. But each American division that entered into the line was entering in with no training, no experience, and they all had to learn those brutal lessons over and over again.
Mike, do you have the next question? You referred to Americans calling Germans Dutch a couple times early in the presentation. Was this common for Americans to refer to them like that?
Yeah, it was pretty common. I've read a lot of firsthand accounts. Americans will call the Germans Fritz, or they'll borrow it from the British or the French. They'll call them Boche. But a lot of them, and they do it with tongue in cheek. They know they're not Dutch, but they do it tongue in cheek. They'll call them Dutchmen. Just like Pennsylvania Germans were called Pennsylvania Dutch. These guys knew they weren't Dutch, but it was a way to kind of poke fun at the enemy.
Sure. Mike, do we have any more questions? Were the replacement troops, were they more National Guard troops or regular Army?
Replacement troops were more often National Army. So you have regular Army were the first, second, third, fourth, fifth divisions that were already in existence. They were theoretically the professional Army divisions that already existed in 1917 were sent to the front. The National Guard divisions, the National Guard Army, had already absorbed by this time most National Guardsmen. So the replacement troops came from what's called National Army, which were draftees. USA inaugurated the draft shortly after it entered the war. One of the things is not well known is that Americans did not volunteer in large numbers when we entered the war. The truth was that there was not a big burst of enthusiasm to go off to fight. The draft was absolutely necessary in order to fill in the army. And these guys they came from everywhere. And they were sent over as replacements and were often in big bunches, were forced into units that were fighting on the front. And tragically, this happened in many cases. You'd have groups of maybe a couple hundred guys at a time who literally had not even learned how to fire their rifles. And they would be sent in as replacements. This happened to the 32nd and others, draftees, right as the unit is on the line and right as it's about to enter combat. And so the veterans would have to take these replacements under their wings and try to teach them how to fight on the fly. And naturally, a lot of them died because they just didn't know what they were supposed to do.
Can you speak, and maybe some of us from the museum can address this a little more, when Wisconsin Highway 32 was officially dedicated to the Red Arrow Division?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe some of your colleagues do.
Actually, Mr. Mike Olson did a bit of quick research on that during the lecture, and he was able to find some information. The highway was dedicated in portions, and it looks like the first portion was dedicated in 1953, and it runs all the way to around 1958. So it was in the mid to late 50s that Wisconsin Highway was dedicated to the Red Arrow Division.
And of course, the Red Arrow had a very distinguished record in World War II as well.
Exactly. Have you come across any sentiments by the Germans toward the 32nd during your, and this was a question for me. The French referred to the AEF as Les Terribles, like you said, but was there any German sentiments were they fearful of their opponents? Did they look at it with some derision, or just anything that you might have come across to speak to how the enemy saw us at the time?
Sure, that's an excellent question, and I read a lot of German sources, contemporary German sources, when I wrote my book Thunder and Flames. The Germans viewed the 32nd with real respect. I think at the time the 32nd entered the lines, the Germans viewed them like they did other American divisions. They were jealous of their the size of the doughboys, who tended to be bigger and healthier. They admired their aggressiveness. This was something that was true all across the lines. The Germans saw the Americans as being very brave and aggressive. But they also recognized that the Americans were really inexperienced and really not well trained, and their attitude was not so much contempt as it was pity. They thought the Americans were trying to achieve successes that they could trumpet in the media. The Germans had a great awareness of the power of the American media. And so they tried to bloody their noses. And this was true. They knew the 32nd came from, let me put it this way. The Germans did not realize that the American divisions had been diluted as much as they had. The Germans believed that they still they represented regions. The Germans were aware that Wisconsin was, up until, from Senator La Follette and others, up until 1917, represented a strong German American community that was opposed to entering the war. And I think they recognized that perhaps by really hurting the Red Arrow, they could kind of drive a chink into that armor of American isolationism. However, it didn't work that way. And as the Red Arrow gained experience and momentum, the Germans, by the time of the Meuse-Argonne, recognized the Red Arrow was one of the best divisions in the American arsenal. So they treated it with great respect.
I think we have just a couple more questions. How much time did the 32nd spend in training from mobilization orders to first contact?
One of the things that I think distinguishes the American divisions in World War I from those in World War II is that in World War I, they entered combat much more quickly from the time of organization to combat than they did in World War II. This is despite in Europe at least, and this is despite the frustration that they had for that first year or so of not being able to organize and get to the front. In truth, the average doughboy from training to combat in many cases would only be a few months. The 32nd was organized as in August of 1917. It spent 3 months or so in training, but in stateside, but then you have to remember a lot of those guys who trained stateside were then sent to serve with other divisions. Moved over to the front in the first few months of 1918, but again, it was used as a replacement division up through May. So a lot of, I don't have the statistics, but a very significant portion of Red Arrow doughboys had only begun their training in May. So, you're talking about guys who were off the farm in April, and they enter into combat in July. So when I see that, I just have tremendous respect for all that they were able to accomplish despite that.
Well, and like you said too, not only entering combat so quickly, but like you said, off the farm, and now you're in European countries. It must have been just a real eye opener to go from one extreme to the other so quickly. Right. At the start of August of 1918, and like you just said, you don't have exact statistics in front of you, but can you put a rough percentage on what portion of the 32nd was still Wisconsin and Michigan veterans or natives, and what percent was made from other elements?
Again, an excellent question, and some divisions were diluted more than others. Some retain more of a regional character than others, like the 77th Division, for example, which was made up of largely of draftees from greater New York City, was still pretty heavily New York by the time it entered combat. I would put the 28th Division, Pennsylvania, at being somewhere in the area of 40% original. The 32nd was less than that. I'd have to say probably a quarter. still retained the initial, maybe even as low as 20%, 20 to 25% retain the original Wisconsin, Michigan affiliation. So it had been diluted a lot.
And I believe we have one more question. Was the lack of drive to fight part of the idea of isolationism? Was that like a not our problem sort of thing from the American perspective?
Yeah, it was partly a not our problem attitude, but it's funny, Americans in 1916, 1917 just were not a very warlike people. I mean, especially in the sense of, I don't even think a lot of them thought about isolationism or thought it out too much. It's just there was no tradition of Americans going to fight overseas. I mean, certainly not outside of the Western Hemisphere. We sent men to fight in Mexico, to fight in the Caribbean, obviously to fight in North America. There had been the Philippines and the Boxer Rebellion, but those were really small expeditions. And there was no tradition whatsoever. That's hard for us to realize today, but there was no tradition whatsoever of America projecting power overseas. And the first major American battle overseas is Belleau Wood in June of 1918. So I just think Americans were not really prepared to think of entering an overseas conflict in a large scale. It was a habit of, I think it was a habit of mind rather than a philosophy for most Americans. And you can see this when the United States enters the war in April, authorities in a lot of places, I studied this for New York City for my last book on the Lost Battalion, they call all these big parades in New York City in April and May, and they assume Americans are going to come out in droves for these parades. And these New Yorkers just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, what does this have to do with me? And if you read the media accounts of these first parades, they say the men are staying home because they're just doing other stuff. Some women show up, even the boys don't care. Even like the little boys don't care. The only people who get worked up about these parades are little girls. And, I think that says something about American society at the time. It just was not, we didn't think this way. And it's interesting how far we've changed.
It certainly is. Dr. Lengel, we greatly appreciate you having you with us tonight. Your presentation was fantastic, and we certainly learned a lot about our own 32nd Red Arrow Division. We'd like to thank everybody else for showing up tonight too. And please don't forget to go to our website and look at our upcoming events for the museum. We have multiple events every single month, and we're going to continue those as we work through these situations with having the museum closed right now. So we appreciate everybody coming out tonight. And once again, Dr. Lengel, thank you so much. It was fantastic to listen to your presentation this evening.